Good afternoon, hello, and welcome. My name is John Glenn. I'm Senior Director at the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy, and I'm really pleased to have you join us here for the release of a new forum report, Kleptocratic Adaptation, Anticipating the Next Stage in the Battle Against Transnational Kleptocracy by Matthew Page and Jodi Vittori, edited by my colleague Melissa Ayton. This is a topic that we at the forum have been working on for a long time, but one that we have been particularly focused on since last February, when Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine really took this issue and brought it to the top of the policy agenda, making folks realize that what has been a long-standing issue and a group of community of people who've been working hard on this challenge, really a chance to link their battle and their challenge to broader national security concerns. As you'll hear and our authors observe, since that time, many of the West and the democracies quickly enacted sanctions and other measures to curtail the ability of kleptocratic networks to operate, often in their own societies. Yet, unsurprisingly, the kleptocrats themselves are adapting, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We think that by understanding and anticipating the ways that kleptocratic networks have adapted, are likely to adapt in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions and efforts that have been taken at this point, it will enable democracies to develop a proactive response to transnational kleptocracy, rather than being on the defensive, but also critically, one that is a global response and not merely a response to the situation and difficulties we see in Russia today. With that, let me briefly just simply turn to my colleague, Melissa Ayton, Senior Program Officer at the International Forum for Democratic Studies, who will introduce our speakers and open our discussion. Thank you, Melissa, over to you.
Great, thanks, John. I also wanted to thank Matthew and Jodi for writing such a great report for us and just being so easy to work with. You guys are so great. So just quick introductions. Matthew T. Page is a non-resident scholar with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's also an associate fellow at Chatham House and a non-resident fellow with the Center for Democracy and Development in Nigeria. He's a widely known expert on kleptocracy with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa. And I hear he's working on a book on kleptocracy, which we're all very excited to read. Jodi Vittori is an expert on the linkages of corruption, state fragility, illicit finance, and US national security. She's also a professor of practice and the co-chair of the Global Politics of Security program at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. She is also a non-resident fellow at Carnegie Endowment. Larry Diamond is the William L. Clayton Senior Fellow at Stanford University, where he's also a Senior Fellow in Global Democracy. He is the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy, and he served at its helm with Mark Plattner for over 30 years. He's also just an amazing mentor and advocate for democracy activists all over the world. So I'm going to start by asking each Matthew, Jodi, and Larry a question, and then we will kind of move more into a discussion. We will be taking questions from the audience, so as you think of them, drop them into the YouTube chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So Matthew, as John alluded to in his intro, many of the democracy community are sort of arguing that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has constituted a big turning point in the fight against kleptocracy. In the report, you have a more nuanced take in that, you argue that the democracy's anti-kleptocracy measures enacted in the last year are, a bit insufficient in light of kleptocratic adaptation. So can you start us off by explaining what you mean by kleptocratic adaptation? What are the trends? What are we seeing? And then, of course, what are the consequences for democracies?
Sure. Thanks, Melissa. And thank you so much to NED for having us and for commissioning the paper. So I think most of the people listening in will be fairly familiar with what kleptocracy is. And so when we talk about kleptocratic adaptation, right, they'll have a sense of what that means in their head. But when we're talking about kleptocracy in this sense, right, we're talking about a transnational phenomenon and transnational networks which funnel ill-gotten gains, around the world, often from kleptocratic jurisdictions, right? Money where countries where that money is actually pilfered and stolen by corrupt elites, and then often stashed in many cases democracies, often in the international financial system itself. So a good way then to think about kleptocratic adaptation is really in two ways. The first is a shifting mix of existing tactics and tools that we're all very familiar with in terms of international money laundering, the use of offshore jurisdictions, right, shell companies. We could talk all day about all those different tactics, but we're focusing down right on actually what's changing, what's new, and what these adaptations are. And that's sort of the second element, right, of kleptocratic adaptation is what are the new trends? Maybe there are new tactics involved as well, ones that we haven't seen before, or unfamiliar variations of those tactics or new mixes, and shifting jurisdictions, because we all know that a lot of transnational kleptocracy revolves around particular jurisdictions that are incredibly corruption prone, and also Western jurisdictions, particularly the UK. It's crown dependencies and offshore territories, but many others, including several US states, where illicit funds can flow freely and be stashed and hidden and accessed by those who steal them. So that's a kind of a key distinction I want to make right up front is, we've got the sort of shifting mix of existing stuff and then some new phenomena as well. And we know that transnational kleptocracy has always been dynamic. But this Ukraine invasion, as we said from the outset, and John mentioned, is sort of a new variable, right? It scrambled the existing picture a little bit, and it did at least initially refocus democracies on the peril that transnational kleptocracy poses. It kind of made it real for them, right? It sort of no longer just became this nebulous thing that we're all worried about. And it actually focused it on a sort of it was a hook, a headline that made it real. It also sped up the pace of change surrounding the issue, right? Because it sent many of those kleptocratic actors, many of whom become complacent after years of essentially impunity or relatively little pushback from democracies, and it sent them scattering a little bit, at least initially. We can argue, later on in the discussion about whether or not that disruption has persisted or whether or not we've settled back into some old patterns. And so what it did for democracies is it forced them to reimagine, I say them, us, forced us to re-examine old assumptions and look for new trends that are coming about. So that's really the meat of kleptocratic adaptation right there. Kleptocratic networks demonstrating flexibility, adaptation. They're identifying and exploiting weaknesses that are pre-existing in the system, and also ones that are sort of worth the extra effort at this point, right? In light of maybe stepped up enforcement, in light of a slight recession in total impunity, and we're back to sort of near impunity, and so some avenues are no longer as accessible as they once were. And kleptocrats, like democracies, are responding to the threat that the democracy's enforcement actions and regulations pose to them, and they're anticipating risk and they're shifting tactics in the same way that democracies should be in response to the kleptocratic adaptation. The one thing I would mention is that discerning or really quantifying, pinpointing kleptocratic adaptation is difficult, right? Because there's so many data points. We're looking at a lot of individual case studies, episodes, many of which are sort of still in flux and developing stories, and some of which are only partially visible on the surface and may only be visible with hindsight. So that's a key point in the sense that kleptocratic adaptation is a slippery threat because it naturally outpaces the efforts of law enforcement, policymakers, and certainly even civil society and the media and democracy advocates to keep up. And it's like hitting a moving target is something that's a good way to think about it. Now, another question you posed, Melissa, was what are we actually seeing in concrete terms in terms of kleptocratic adaptation? So that's sort of the big picture. Now, what are we actually looking at? As I mentioned, the Western response to the Ukraine invasion has been, an increased scope and scale of individuals targeted, right? Very much focused on the sort of Ukraine, Russia space, right? Not so much in, Argentina or, Papua New Guinea, but in that sort of focus. It's sent, those agencies and department into sort of overtime, right? Focusing on those threats. And as we know, there are opportunity costs when you surge resources in one direction. There's potentially opportunities for individuals in other sort of spheres or jurisdictions to take advantage of that. We also have the issue of kleptocratic adaptation that goes back to what I was initially talking about in terms of the distinction between transnational kleptocracy, that set of activities, and then what are individual kleptocracies doing, right? Kleptocracies like Russia or the United Arab Emirates. What are they doing in terms of this story? How are they adapting and changing tack? For example, in Russia, Russia's become more of a repressive kleptocracy, in the short term as they've sort of gone into invasion mode. The UAE, we've seen sort of striking a more conciliatory note, especially since it fell afoul of the Financial Action Task Force last year. It's really been trying to, I guess, clean up its image. Whether or not that actually has led to real world cleanups is another question. While at the same time, we've seen an increased, almost like a magnet, a lot of dirty money flowing into the UAE from the Russia sphere of conflict. So few themes, right, that we mention especially hard and especially strongly in the paper. One is, the anti-democratic regimes, kleptocratic regimes, finding new ways to weaponize corruption. That's a really key point, and we'll talk about that later. And then also the increased relevance of bridging regimes, which I know Jodi will talk about in a moment. That's another really key theme. So I'll allude to those, and then we'll strike back later. And then your final question, right, is so what? What does this mean for democracies or democracy, global democracy writ large? This is again a very expansive topic, so I'll just hit the high points, which is, kleptocratic adaptation is really all about exploiting new and newly relevant weaknesses in democracy's own defenses. Exposing those long-running failures in terms of policy and enforcement, and a real lack of policy consensus around the threat that global corruption and transnational kleptocracy poses. So we know that for democracies, kleptocracy is an unconventional threat insofar as it both inflicts damage in and of itself, and also it kind of co-ops and weakens and erodes the resilience of its adversary, democratic systems, making it harder for them to fight that kleptocracy going forward. So it's a very insidious threat, and so that's a big consequence for democracies, is the nature of the threat and how corrosive it is, for lack of a better word. So this paper, as I think you mentioned up front, makes a very forward-leading argument on this point, and that is that transnational kleptocracy is not a niche policy concern. It's a defining challenge, and one with outsized strategic consequences. So we liken it, either we do so explicitly in the paper, or certainly in our conversations, we've likened it to the threat of climate change, or the threat of fascism, almost a century ago, in terms of that sort of that being a really key threat to the future of democracy. So in other words, it's not a nice to have, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could ... But it's one that underpins many other strategic interests that both the United States and other democracies have, and those include stability, development, the free flow of global trade and commerce, all of those things, and things like governance and human rights. So with that, I'm going to put a full stop there and hand the floor back to you. But surely, we'll dive into a lot more detail on these issues as the conversation develops. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matthew. You covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. But let's, since this idea of bridging jurisdictions, regimes, we went through a lot of different names for them. Since it's such a central part of the report, I want to turn to Jodi to hear, more about what they are and how they've sort of emerged as this conduit for illicit funds, despite all the sanctions and other enforcements imposed against, kleptocracy at large in the last year. So Jodi?
Thanks. And thanks again to National Endowment for Democracy for sponsoring this project. Bridging jurisdictions are probably going to be one of the biggest headaches, I think, for Western democracies as this new international system sort of develops. What's going to happen with a rising China? What's going to happen in response to Russia's newest invasion of Ukraine? And what does the international system look like? But one of the big challenges are these bridging jurisdictions. These are locations that are uniquely set up to profit from facilitating kleptocratic activity, both in their own countries, for those who are highly authoritarian and corrupt, or perhaps could be considered kleptocratic, but also facilitating the kleptocracies like Russia, like China, like Iran going forward. And so how we've defined these bridging jurisdictions is these are locations that have very strong linkages in the financial system, in the international trade system. They're very well linked between banks and so forth, very much enmeshed. And they have enabled themselves and postured themselves so that they can be a unique conduit. So that, for example, really coming to the fore with Russia and the sanctions on Russia and its associated oligarchs, they're there available to profit from those oligarchs bringing in their cash, they're landing their planes, parking their yachts, etc. And they also act as conduits so that that oligarchic money, those resources back to the kleptocratic regimes, can really continue to flow to the Western financial system to rule of law countries. Now, of course, having that kleptocratic cash, the oligarch cash flowing into rule of law Western countries has its own problems that are well documented, whether it's the role of lobbying, reputation laundering, sports washing. Of course, that was a high topic with the World Cup on recently. To also the fact that it means that oligarchs and regimes don't have to suffer the consequence of their actions as much. And for those oligarchs who do want to maintain their ties with the international in the Western world, keep their houses and so forth, as long as they're hidden behind shells of anonymous shell companies and trusts and hedge funds and so forth, as long as they make a end run through places like UAE or places like Turkey, they can still largely access those finances and those businesses. And we keep, seeing in the newspapers and stuff where such and such businesses linked to certain Russian oligarchs, United States or elsewhere. So they really provide that, but they also mean that with that link to the Western trade and financial system, that places like Russia can also receive the financing that helps keep the Russian kleptocratic regime in power. They can potentially, through trade-based money laundering and other trade smuggling and so on, receive crucial materials that they need to be able to maintain their war against Ukraine. And so we see this both we use Turkey and UAE as key examples that really are highlighted by the sanctions on Russia in response to Russia's latest invasion of Ukraine. And the reason we look at these is these are both countries that are gray listed by the Financial Action Task Force for having been involved heavily in money laundering and not for being potential conduits for terrorism finance, for having their system uniquely open to that. And, we've seen plenty of yachts and planes and stuff land in both locations, plenty of indications that this has been a relatively welcoming place, at least where few questions are asked when Russian oligarchs and their money show up. Indeed, The Economist this week reported that in 2021, Russians were the 8th largest purchasers of real estate in the United Arab Emirates. In 2022, once sanctions came in, they were number 1. And, if you have trouble moving your cash, they'll be happy to take your crypto. If, not too many questions will be asked about where the source of that crypto or who's buying that property going forward. So they've postured themselves as a unique location to be able to function with this. Normally, states that enable this sort of activity would find themselves under significant sanction by the Western community, think North Korea. But these are strategically very, very important states to other goals in the international global system right now. Let's look at Turkey for a minute. It's a NATO country. if we want to bring Finland and Sweden into NATO, they have to give the okay. They control the Bosporus. The way they have interpreted international law, it has prevented Russia from being able to put in additional naval craft into the Black Sea, for example. They've been important in arming Ukraine. They've been important in facilitating grain exports from the Ukraine during this war. So they're systemically very important. So putting a lot of pressure on Turkey to not facilitate sanctions evasions by Russians, to push back much harder on that, could hurt larger strategic goals that the Western world has, including the defense of Ukraine. As the United States and the West is trying to close doors on Russian kleptocratic cash, and that enables the regime and enables them to fight it, in Ukraine, Turkey in many ways is opening a window and a backdoor for them. And by trying to close that window, we might close off on other strategic issues. Same with the United Arab Emirates, very strategically important. The United States and France both have Navy bases there. Even South Korea has an agreement to use its special forces to defend the UAE should they ever be attacked, and they do a lot of training there and have large scale, everybody in the West does. Thousands of Western businesses have their regional headquarters there and don't really have another great place to put their regional businesses. Media is centered there. It's the 5th largest arms importer in the world. It has only decent military in the Middle East and in that region. And so it's strategically very important as well. And so the West has some tough choices to make strategically if it's going to push back. That has larger strategic implications when it chooses to do so. And I think the one example that we really see an example of how these bridging regimes really undermine larger Western goals, larger democratic goals in the world and the rule of law system has to do with a scandal that's called Halkbank, which involved both Turkey and UAE. Rather than being about Russia, this particular scandal involves laundering as much as $100 billion on behalf of the Iranian regime. So as the Western world is working very hard to put in sanctions to encourage Iran to come to the bargaining table on its nuclear weapons, clearly a very high priority strategic item for the United States and NATO and the West. Here we have Turkey and the UAE facilitating the ability for goods and money and so forth, both to the Iranian regime and for that money to end into the Western system. So to explain a little bit of what this particular example was, from 2008 to 2016, so I mentioned about $100 billion is estimated to have been laundered according to the Department of Justice, indictments and court papers, as well as copious media reporting on multiple countries and multiple continents. I should note that Halkbank denies any criminal activity or civil, criminal, or otherwise, and that is currently in front of the Supreme Court as we speak, the US Supreme Court, not the Turkish. Turkey had a unique dispensation in the sanctions on Iran, in that they had the right to purchase oil and gas from Iran, but they couldn't just pay the funds back to Iran because of sanctions. So part of this dispensation of sanctions is that they could export goods to Iranian private individuals. So they used this loophole to purchase the oil, put the oil in state-owned banks or state-controlled banks like Halkbank, hence the name of the scandal, as well as other banks. And then through a network of shell companies, front companies, trade-based money laundering, fake contracts, and so forth. They have a network under an Iranian Turkish businessman by the name of Reza Zarrab, who buys gold from all over, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, moves that gold in through the United Arab Emirates, which is notoriously lax when it comes to doing due diligence on gold and making sure it's not from fragile states or conflict states or anything else. That gold is then sold ostensibly as exports from Turkey to private Iranian individuals, but really because through those shell companies, through those fake contracts, money and goods are rerouted into to Iran itself. Huge bribes go to the key individuals involved. So various Turkish media and Turkish investigators were able to show that bribes went up to President Erdogan himself, his son Bilal. Literally, there were shoeboxes of cash involved with bribes, multiple Turkish ministers. One of the perpetrators in the Halkbank scandal claims that it went all the way up to Iranian President Ahmadinejad was receiving bribes. Again, senior Iranian officials were receiving bribes. There's plenty of money flowing around. And so, what we end up having in the end is not only is that a tremendous amount of money to come into Iran, and that undermined the larger goals of sanctioning Iran's nuclear program and bringing them to the table for negotiations. It also reinforced the kleptocratic regime of Iran. And I think the Iranian people are making it quite clear what they think about that regime, enabling it to better withstand the popular protest against the regime over time. A lot of that money, billions of dollars, entered the Western financial system as well. So according to the various court documents and so forth, about 2.2 billion flowed through JP Morgan Chase, 1.3 billion through Deutsche Bank, 1.2 billion through Standard Chartered. The list goes on, a billion here, a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about a lot of money. And so it really highlights, I think, how these bridging jurisdictions really undermine larger Western goals. And as this new international system kind of develops, where we don't really completely know if it's multipolar, bipolar, how it's going to look exactly, there is some level of more open rule of law systems versus more closed authoritarian and often kleptocratic systems. And these bridging jurisdictions, which are authoritarian systems themselves, and as the name implies, creates that ability for, even as the West closes doors on kleptocratic activity, it leaves the windows wide open for them to be able to operate at least sufficiently enough to keep the regimes in power and undermine larger Western goals. So Melissa, back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jodi. I want to switch gears a little bit and turn to Larry. To date, much of the response to kleptocracy has really been about enacting measures that restrict kleptocratic access, boy, that's hard to say, to financial systems in the democracies. And that's obviously key. We can't get anywhere in the fight against kleptocracy unless we do that. But we hear less about what needs to be done in the so-called source countries, or the places where theft occurs, to stop kleptocracy at its origins. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how kleptocracy impacts democracy in those settings, and why the broader democracy assistance community, who might not think of kleptocracy in their sort of wheelhouse of things to care about, why they should care.
So before I answer your question, I want to say a couple other things, and thank you for having me. The first is to heap praise on this extraordinary report that Jodi and Matthew have produced. It's very timely. It's obviously in the latest in a sequence of outstanding work that the International Forum for Democratic Studies has been doing. So thank you, John, and thank you, Melissa, for the entire stream of work on this issue. But really, my hat goes off to both Jodi and Matthew for their life's work on this issue. And also in particular to Jodi for her founding and coordination of the anti-corruption advocacy network, ACAN. I've got to tell you, Jodi, that there aren't many sources of emails I get that I receive in a group context more frequently than from you in the network. And sometimes my eyes roll, but they're just extremely informative and invaluable. And if we're going to prevail in this struggle, we need a very vigorous, well-informed, kind of morally and intellectually solid and consolidated, if not unified, network. So I really want to call that out. Secondly, I want to say specifically about Turkey's role as a bridging country. Every word you were saying, Jodi, about what Turkey has been doing with Iran, I'm thinking Venezuela, check mark. The gold flows, check mark. The illicit money back to the regime, check mark. In fact, as I understand it from Venezuelan friends, the establishment on Turkish Airlines of a nonstop direct flight from Caracas to Istanbul. Why the heck would they need a nonstop fight. Study the flow of dirty money from Venezuela to Turkey, and literally gold exports, illicit gold mining, I might say. It's entirely off the books in Venezuela and to the Turkish market. And I think you understand the reason. I'm not sure this is very well understood, because obviously Venezuela has oil, as does Iran, and it's been a major source of sustenance of the regime, even with the sanctions. But those gold flows have added another layer of financial cushion for the regime, and another layer of incentive to hang on to power, because the money just goes directly into their personal pockets. It's predatory in the worst sense of the word. Now, Matthew has been for some time one of our leading experts, first kind of below the radar screen and then kind of above the radar screen on Nigeria. And when you talk about what can be done at the source, well, Nigeria is a pretty big and dramatic source. Outside the highest profile sinner here, Russia, and so you should come back to Matthew on this, Melissa, before we move on. But I'll offer my own thoughts in the following bullet points. First of all, I've been arguing for about 30 years now that we should view kleptocracy as a crime against humanity. And I am not exaggerating when I put it this way. I once, there's no reason why Nigeria should have a lower per capita income than Ghana. I mean, this is ridiculous to contemplate. Nigeria has at least as much entrepreneurial spirit in principle. It's got oil, which Ghana's only recently developed. It should be at least as prosperous a country. And the reason it's not is corruption and the massive, cynical, relentless, predatory export of the ill-gotten gains of endemic, large-scale kleptocratic corruption into the bloodstream of, well, initially Western, I'm sure a lot of it's going to the Middle East now, financial and real estate and other markets and assets. When you have this kind of relentless extraction of a country's wealth, and then once it's extracted, it doesn't even recirculate in the country, it's sent abroad. How can countries develop in the midst of this? About 10 years ago, I had to speak in Nigeria. I had to give a public lecture there. And I just compared the under 5 death rate for children in Nigeria and children in Ghana over time. I don't have the figures exactly at hand, but the under 5 death rate in Ghana is about half that of Nigeria, and maybe even less than that. And it's been coming down dramatically, of course, in both countries with the progression of modern medicine, but it's still 8%, 10% of Nigerian children dying before their 5th birthday. And the question to ask is how many fewer children would have died if Nigeria had the middling level of under 5 child death rate, or for Africa, somewhat, better than average level that Ghana has. And the answer is you could have saved several 100,000 lives over a period of a decade or two. Now, if you had a terrorist force killing several 100,000 children over a decade, you would indict them in the International Criminal Court for crime against humanity. Why is it less a crime against humanity when the politicians of the country and high-level bureaucrats and the military officers in complicity with them also, I'm sorry, I'm just going to be blunt, feeding at the trough as a payoff not to stage a coup? Why is that less of a crime against humanity? I think we need to change the way we talk about this. That's the first thing. The second thing is we need to greatly empower the resources, skills, investigative tools and techniques of legal, journalistic, and other anti-corruption researchers and reporters on the ground or connected to the ground in these source countries. And this is going to require money, a lot of money. So I think when we seize these assets, we're now talking particularly at Stanford at the Freeman Spogli Institute, where our former ambassador to Russia, Mike McFall, who's also the director of FSI, has been leading, I think, a cutting edge thought group on Russia sanctions, including on all these Russian kleptocrats. I think there's a growing body of policy analysis and legal thought that believes we can and should apply these seized assets from Russian kleptocrats at some point after to the reconstruction of Ukraine. But what about seized assets from other kleptocrats in the world? Well, first of all, we need to do a lot more seizing and prosecution. And, hopefully we'll come to that. That is a story for the United States and Britain and the European Union, most of all. Let's not, it's going to be hard enough, heroic enough a struggle to get the liberal democracies of the world to take this seriously and move legally. We're not going to get the UAE and Turkey to do any of this heavy lifting, but as we develop more of a pool of seized assets, the idea is generally you then return the ill-gotten wealth to the country. And, Matthew is, I'm sure, following this more closely than me. I don't know how much of the estimated $8 billion that Sani Abacha stole from Nigeria during during the nadir of Nigeria's entire history of governance, when rule became most tyrannical and absolute. But, I've heard a figure of $1 billion or something like that. If you then just put that $1 billion back into the Nigerian treasury, I'm sorry to be so crude about it, but what do you think's going to happen to it? So maybe we should think more creatively about creating an international anti-kleptocracy fund that would fund and train accountants, lawyers, researchers, and journalists in tracking the sources of money, in examining public accounts, in knowing which public accounts should be more transparently reported, and how they should be reported in ways that can be accessible, so that we could get maybe more interaction between our diplomatic standards and requests and the knowledge and requests of people on the ground who are tracking this. In the end, so much of this depends in the United States, in Britain, in our own murky corporate registration, banking, real estate, and other markets. So much of, and of course on the ground in these countries that are, endemically badly governed, on transparency. And we've got to, fight relentlessly for more transparency, and we have to pry the transparency out of the, selfish, greedy, extractive clutches of the cabals of elites that are bleeding their countries of the resources they need for development. And I know that language sounds, maybe can sound a bit overwrought, but I mean, come on, look at what's been happening. In this regard, I want to call out something that the National Endowment for Democracy has been involved in, along with Luminate, the foundation in the UK that was spawned by Omidyar Network, the Open Society Foundation, and probably a couple others, which is the recent birth of something called the International Fund for Public Interest Media. I think this is a really interesting model that, first of all, can be important in the struggle against kleptocracy, because the media that would be funded by the International Fund, much of it would be investigative media, the kind of networks that revealed the Panama Papers and other grand schemes of kleptocratic corruption. And if we can fund local media, either within these countries or sometimes like exiled Russian media based in Estonia, something like that, or Belarusian, or Turkish. I mean, the Turkish media have just been battered by Erdogan's rule. And I don't know where they are anymore, but I think in some of these regimes, the only way to fight back adequately is to have a base of online media operations in exile with confidential flows of reporting and information on secure platforms like Signal and Telegram and so on. And, you know, how is such a media enterprise going to finance itself? What's the business model? You know, that's what so many people who have passed through journalism programs, like our night journalism program here at Stanford, the one-year fellowship program, have been asking. You know, the conclusion I've come to is that in some of these cases of media, they're going to be the most focused on public investigation and the direct frontal challenge against kleptocratic rule. There is no business model. They're not going to, you know, sell their online work at a level that's going to pay for the quality and scale and professionalism of investigation and reporting and publishing, and, you know, with the proper amount of legal advice that they need. It's got to be subsidized. And if Putin can subsidize his propagandistic media, and Xi Jinping can do the same at a staggering level through the Xinhua news agency and so on, and the Voice of China and China Daily and so on, and Erdogan can subsidize his and so on. You know, we in the, quote, free world need to be able and willing to subsidize on a very large scale, on an annual basis, independent media that are going to do this work, and not with the illusion. Of course, we encourage them to develop stable readership, a bit of advertising, you know, some revenue, wonderful. But they're going to need to be, and I think deserve to be, subsidized by the democracies of the world on a large scale into the indefinite future. And just one last quick point, which is the obvious one that flows from the very first moments of this session being introduced and bleeds through many pages of this report. It's not, you know, idealistic foreign aid on this issue of fighting international kleptocracy through the pursuit of quality reporting, transparency, investigation, and so on. It's an investment in our own democracy and our own economic security.
Great, thank you. So everyone has raised about, I don't know, 4,000 things we could, you know, take on to a longer conversation. I do want to try and keep it focused a little bit on this adaptation issue. So both how the kleptocrats are adapting, how the democracies need to adapt, and, you know, sort of starting one of these international media funds is certainly an example of that, and how activists and journalists need to adapt to respond to the kleptocracy challenge. On the sort of latter two categories, I was wondering if I could get all of your quick thoughts, so we can get some questions from the audience in on, you know, how do policymakers, activists, journalists, what are the sort of top order items for them in terms of how they should adapt their methods, their tactics, how they work together to tackle this challenge of global kleptocracy? So I'm not sure if anyone wants to start. Otherwise, I can call on someone. I'm going to call on Jodi.
All right. And you even unmuted me. Thank you so much, Melissa. The one area, you know, there's been good improvements in cooperation on this. And I've been delighted to see issues like the Repo Task Force, which is a multinational task force, intelligence sharing, and so forth when it comes after kleptocrats themselves. as a retired Air Force officer, as someone who's very much into more of the hard power issues, I would really like this to be taken on as the same national security type of standard that we look at other global threats, that we took the war against terrorism, for example, in. I think back to when I was a dumb captain on 9/11, and the follow-on Patriot Act and the significant laws and how we viewed terrorist groups and how we monitored for them and the money that went to understanding them and how we trained our military and adapted our military education system and other education systems to deal with it. And we have not seen the equivalent in general against kleptocracies, which were relevant even before the recent invasion of Ukraine, but certainly have come to the forefront with the latest invasion of Ukraine. There was some great legislation put in here in the United States, the Enablers Act, for example, that didn't make it into the NDAA, that didn't come out. The Corporate Transparency Act had already been passed, which is fantastic. Treasury's been working very hard on coming up with the 3 sets of rules, but really having the rules be prioritized, be as strong as possible, making sure the databases and so forth are funded, making sure that the personnel are there. And coming from someone who's taught formally at 2 military schools, the Air Force Academy and National Defense University, these sorts of topics aren't in the curriculum, in part leftovers from how the Goldwater-Nichols Act is set up and what constitutes appropriate military education, because the act was from the 1980s and the world has changed a lot, and what we understand about conflict has changed a great deal since the 1980s. But we really haven't adapted our national security structure. If I want to go talk to DOD on who is their point officer on kleptocracy, I don't have one. There's nobody for me to go talk to. Even the State Department, Richard Nephew is an amazing individual, but it took literally years before he was even brought onto the State Department as the coordinator. And so there's amazing people doing amazing work throughout the US government with great interest at heart, but we're not seeing the same response in how we protect our own systems in the United States and in NATO and the Western world at large that we saw after 9/11, even with the invasion of Ukraine. And, just to give an idea of some of the really hard national security issues we face, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that Russia invaded Ukraine is that all autocracies and kleptocracies find it very threatening to have a similar, not the same, but a next door neighboring populace next door that's relatively better governed. And thus, because they're relatively better governed, they're relatively wealthier and better off and just happier in general, where people have a choice and can make, choose how they want to live their lives. And that's very threatening. So having a relatively democratic, cleaning up, trying to clean up their corruption, motivated civil society and press next door in Ukraine really showed to the Russian people, hey, there are better alternatives out there than Putin's kleptocracy. Likewise, when we're looking at China, there's a lot of issues with China and Taiwan, but certainly having a relatively democratic, robust democracy of Taiwan, much wealthier than China. Remember, China and Taiwan started at the same economic base in 1949. These places were dirt poor through a lot of missteps, not all of which has to do with corruption. We think of the Great Leap Forward, that definitely was not the Great Leap Forward, and so forth in China. The Chinese people are much, much poorer than their Asian neighbors around them that started out at nothing at the end of World War II with a strong democratic system. That's a very scary thing for Xi Jinping to have to look at. Taiwan and South Korea both are viable alternatives to the Chinese kleptocracy. And I don't think we're treating that with the same national security threat, the hardcore, hard power national security threats that it should be treated as.
Great, thank you. Matthew or Larry, either one of you want to chime in?
I'm happy to jump in a little bit. I think there's a real obvious, I guess, way in which we can charge the sort of civil society, democracy, advocacy, scholar community, that we all sort of on this call, many of you belong to, and that Larry, myself, and Jodi, and Melissa, and the NED folks, we all sort of overlap this space. What can we do to sort of force or prompt this change in thinking among policymakers? And I think it's important, I think, to really understand that is the key audience here, and I'll explain why in a minute. And for lack of a better word, Larry knows I'm pretty outspoken about U.S. Nigeria policy in this regard. the report that Jodi and I wrote on Dubai as a global entrepot of illicit financial flows hits on a lot of these notes as well, which is to constructively critique U.S. policy and really call out some of the inconsistencies and missteps, many of which Jodi highlighted there. Because what's key, and it's an issue that we hit upon in the report, is to win these internal arguments. So much rides not on necessarily what is happening, in the gold souk in Dubai itself. I mean, that's important, but it's something that, we have limited ability to change directly. But what we can do within democracies themselves is try to point out these policy missteps, these policy failures, where the sort of short-termism when it comes to transnational kleptocracy undermines our long-term strategic interests. And so not only does this involve some fresh thinking and re-examined assumptions in terms of our foreign policy, it also requires a recognition that that fighting transnational kleptocracy will entail some tough domestic policy choices, and that these issues that we all live and breathe on a daily basis and are really important to us, the issues that Larry mentioned in terms of what's going on the ground in Nigeria and the extreme sort of immiserating effect that kleptocracy has in not just in Africa, but in countries around the world, kleptocracy and corruption, because of course you can have corruption without it being so severe as to become a kleptocracy. But that we need to bring this home to a domestic audience as well, and find those synergies, and find where the issues resonate in ways that can prevent democracies from becoming a conducive environment where transnational kleptocracy sort of clicks in and thrives. And I feel like, and this is to sort of, in a sense, be, not to be pessimistic, but I think there's an incredible uphill battle there. And I think Larry mentioned that, as well. And even marshaling the evidence, which civil society researchers, investigative journalists do, is only part of the problem. I mean, one of the things I observed during my time at the State Department and elsewhere in government was evidence-based policymaking is still not always the norm. There's a whole lot of considerations in addition to sort of what's actually happening that weigh on policy decisions. And the way I would describe this, I've described this before, as sort of zombie policymaking, or old playbooks sort of refusing to be put away and replaced with new playbooks. And we see that in U.S. policy towards Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and also towards Nigeria. Where again, the incentives in sort of turning a blind eye to kleptocracy are less apparent than they are in a country like Turkey or the UAE, where those are viewed as islands of stability or influence in otherwise very unstable regions. In Nigeria, this is just really having to do with some cognitive dissonance and sloppy policymaking. The fact that Nigeria, which is, as Larry said, is one of the world's sort of most insidious kleptocracies, is, invited to the Summit of Democracy, sort of lauded by top U.S. officials as a bastion of global democracy, is just totally disconnected from the realities on the ground. And we saw during the End SARS protests in the country in 2020, when there was an opportunity for democracies to at least try to provide top cover and defend the young Nigerians who were coming out in the street to protest police brutality, which again is very much a symptom of the kleptocratic nature and predatory nature of the state that Larry mentioned. What did we do? We sort of equivocate, the US and the UK and the EU to different degrees, but the US was the worst, equivocated about the those protests and really emboldened the kleptocrats and essentially normalized that behavior. So the normalization of these behaviors, we saw it with the Salisbury poisonings in the UK, the flows of course, money from kleptocracies into global democracies to fund political parties. All these behaviors have been normalized by democracies. And I would leave it here and say that what we and civil society and journalists and citizens have the ability to do is sort of really push back on policymakers' desensitization and acceptance and normalization of those behaviors. That's not to say that we, slap sanctions on 2/3 of the countries in the world, or we, slap leaders in handcuffs when they come to visit the UN, but it's about modulating our policy interactions to reflect realities on the ground and not some sort of, aspirational vision of what countries like Nigeria or the UAE or others, what we think them to be rather than what they are. And I'll leave it there.
Larry, do you want to chime in at all? You're muted. There you go.
I have something. I agree with everything Matthew said. I have something additional to say, and it's a bit controversial. But since I won't name names here, I'll just make a general point that I think we do need to name names. We need to name and shame. And I'm not talking about the kleptocrats that we take for granted as an imperative to expose, track, condemn, and where possible, prosecute. I'm talking about the kleptocracy industry, the political economy of kleptocracy in the United States, in the United Kingdom, most of all those two places, probably France third, and the European Union more generally. One of the things I've learned from the reading I've done on kleptocracy, including, I think, this very important new book by Raymond Baker, Invisible Trillions, is that there is this vast, interconnected, and quite often, highly respectable and even prestigious collection of lawyers, brokers, real estate agents, fixers, lobbyists who are eagerly representing and facilitating all this. Not illegal. They're not violating the law, to my knowledge. But, if you're an international law firm in Washington, D.C., and you're trying to help one of these sleazy kleptocrats normalize and launder their wealth and recirculate it into the United States, and then seek even societal respect and honor through their philanthropic contributions and so on. I don't have any trouble saying this is deeply immoral. If your prestigious law firm is going to represent these people in doing these things, or your real estate firm, I think these people should be named and shamed and disgraced. And I think that if we start a campaign to do that, they won't be able to sustain the reputational damage that they will suffer. And they'll have to choose between facilitating this kind of destructive assault on the developmental possibilities of these countries, and obscene recirculation of this essentially stolen wealth through the bloodstream of our own financial real estate, corporate, registration, philanthropic, and other flows. They'll have to choose between that and, the standing they want in society to get more conventional types of work. So I think we've got to go to work on this industry. One element of going to work on it would be that. A second element would be to think about, are there ways that we can make some of what they've been doing actually illegal? We've made, I think, some progress. Jodi could probably speak to it legally in terms of minimum requirements for business and registration, transparency, and transparency in real estate transactions. But I think it's still pretty limited. And we still have this perverse situation of the race to the bottom between states like Nevada and Delaware in getting the money from these registrations of dubious and not very transparent corporations. And I'm sorry, I believe in federalism, but there's plenty of precedent for federal regulation to limit the scope of what states can do. And Nevada and Delaware have too much scope. And I don't care if the president of the United States comes from Delaware or not. Actually, I think he's moved in a surprisingly, at least somewhat better direction, given where he comes from. But they should not have the scope to race to the bottom in this way. And states, I think, should be much more constrained by federal regulation on what they can do to give scope to business registration. And my advice to these states is find other sources of revenue. This shouldn't be one of your major sources of revenue.
Great, thank you. So I do want to make sure we have time to get some questions from the audience. And part of Larry's comment relates to one of the questions that has come in. Just a reminder, if you have questions, put them in the YouTube chat. If you have my email address, you can also email them to me, as some people are. So, one of the questions relates to, it sort of relates to this enabling role. So they're asking about transnational and multinational corporations and their role in facilitating kleptocracy, how they sort of differ from, what makes what they're doing sort of considered illicit and everything else is illicit, if that makes sense. If anyone wants to kind of chime in on the role of these multinational corporations, that would be great. Looks like Matthew is moving to unmute. There we go.
my motion towards. No, I mean, I think it's a difficult issue, isn't it? Because at the same time as democracies are trying to facilitate trade between countries and rely on that international trade, even between countries that are relatively unsavory, and of course, blanket sanctions, right, would be incredibly punitive towards populations that, again, you want, when you're looking at anti-kleptocracy actions, you want to, you want to encourage the dekleptification of governments, not the erosion of societies as a whole, because that actually strengthens, right, the hand of kleptocrats and strengthens their control. But I think if you look at a few, top examples of where international companies are really playing a very questionable role in strengthening kleptocracy, is certainly right in the oil and gas sector, and certainly in countries like Equatorial Guinea. I think that, U.S. international policy towards Equatorial Guinea is very bizarre, given that it is certainly no secret, right, that Equatorial Guinea is one sort of the apotheosis of international kleptocracy at the moment. Senior members of the regime have made very sort of engaged in very high profile corruption and had brushes with law enforcement in both the United States and in Europe and so forth. Yet, Western oil companies sort of have a very close working relationship with the government there, and and serve as an integral part of the regime's cash flow. And I'm not, again, saying that they are in violation of a particular law, or either there or here, but what I am saying is that clearly there's sort of a causal linkage there. It's also bizarre, again, to see U.S. policymakers, especially in the case of Equatorial Guinea, sort of traveling there, kissing the ring of kleptocrats to try to dissuade them from allowing a Chinese naval base there. Again, that's an incredibly short-sighted strategic approach that I feel like, any international relations undergrad could, really point out that is sort of, detrimental to U.S. strategic interests long-term. So I think countries like Equatorial Guinea, Angola is another, I think, good example. Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't mean to pick on African kleptocracies. Those are just three that come to mind. I think, Larry, you mentioned sort of Venezuela earlier, and of course we know that in the wake of the Ukraine invasion, there was sort of a very interestingly, rapid sort of rapprochement between the U.S. and the Venezuelan regime over, oil sales. So I get that. The point is, we understand that policymakers have to make trade-offs, right, between competing interests. And we talk about this in the paper. And I think what we've argued in this paper, and I've argued in the past related to Nigeria, is that we, democracies and policymakers specifically, need to be upfront about those trade-offs. They need to articulate them. They need to explain their cost-benefit analysis and sort of allow that to be murder boarded a little bit by, the democracy community, So I'm always sort of very surprised, looking particularly at U.S. policy towards Nigeria and other places as well, that here you have, don't listen to Matthew Page, of course, he's always, beating a dead horse when it comes to these things. But when Larry Diamond, one of the country's, top democracy scholars, and someone who, has deep credibility in this area, sort of flags this disconnect, maybe it should give you, the policymaker, pause. There isn't sort of a separate set of Nigeria scholars who are lauding U.S. approach to Nigeria or the U.S. approach to Equatorial Guinea and Angola and so forth. Maybe you should sort of really step back and think about whether or not these policy approaches are detrimental. And certainly if you are a company, getting back to your original question, about the role of multinationals, our listeners' question about multinationals and IOCs, certainly question whether, from a reputational and also from an investor, return on investment standpoint, whether or not this is, a strategy that merits being continued and often expanded or pursued. And the argument that if we don't do it, sort of Chinese companies will, is, that doesn't really hold weight. I don't think. I think it really lacks merit. There need to be other strategic considerations as well if you're to make that argument. So I'll leave it there and get off my my anti-kleptocracy soapbox for a moment.
I don't think you want to do the latter. I just want to make one brief, really 30-second point about Equatorial Guinea in two parts. Number one, Teodoro Obiang is among the kleptocrats of the world, just in proportional terms to the amount of the country's wealth he's personally extracted and the developmental price the society has suffered for it, is literally the worst kleptocrat in the world. But the second point is that I think very few people have paid attention to is the damage that his kleptocracy has done elsewhere in West Africa. This is, I think, one of the matters that our investment in investigative journalism ought to pursue, but I think his dirty money has actually compromised the quality of governance, the integrity of rule elsewhere in West Africa. And I think serious pursuit of the truth might show that democracy in the Gambia has been one of the casualties.
I would just add to that, it's not just in the individual countries, it's in the regional bloc institutions, the African Union. It's quite powerful. Jodi, did you want to add anything quickly? I do want to move on to our lightning round because I think it'll be fun.
No, I think they pretty much covered everything.
Okay. So, we thought we would just close out with a quick lightning round of questions, because if you can't have fun talking about kleptocracy, you're just doing something wrong, I guess. So I'm going to ask very broad questions. The fun part is that you only have 30 seconds to answer. If you take longer than 30 seconds, we have arranged an oligarch to steal your house. So you'll want to make sure that you stick to that 30-second rule. The first question is the second Summit for Democracy is fast approaching at the end of March. What would you recommend as sort of the top order item to come from the summit in the context of countering kleptocracy, obviously? Let's do Matthew first.
Okay, got my stopwatch here. So think about whether or not you really want to include kleptocracies in the summit. So these, I went through the list earlier: Nigeria, Angola, DRC. Focus on facilitating countries. So and the domestic policy choices there, have a way to use it as a venue to discuss those. And US can lead by example here, and the UK can participate as well. There are a lot of countries that are facilitators on that list. I'll name a couple. So Belize, Cyprus, Mauritius, Panama, Caribbean countries. I'll leave it at that.
Jodi?
Sure. The oligarch can steal my house so long as he cleans it first. That's all I ask. And walks the dog. That said, I think we could really stand to see the US acting much more at home and Europeans acting much more at home, telling other countries to go clean up their act, when we clearly, the United States is well acknowledged, is probably the easiest place to still launder your money. And the Corporate Transparency Act is a tremendous start in there, but the loopholes are big enough to put a Mack truck through. If we really are going to take this seriously and tell other countries to take it seriously, we need to take it seriously from a legislative perspective. The reason those bridging jurisdictions can use our Western system so easily is because it's wide open for them to use it. They can profit tremendously because we're wide open. The bridging jurisdictions wouldn't matter as much if the bridge didn't go anywhere. So we need to make it so the bridge doesn't go anywhere.
Larry?
I love that metaphor. Two things. First of all, at this next summit, countries are supposed to report on what they've done and talked about with their own societies to improve their quest for democracy. Obviously, we can only think about it in that way if we're talking about a place like Angola. And I think we should be serious about asking them to be accountable for whether they've held these discussions. And secondly, as I've already said, we ought to be talking seriously about how we can elevate and activate this International Fund for Public Interest Media.
All right, I think everyone still has their house. Let's start with Jodi for the next question. What will be the next bridging jurisdiction to emerge to sort of challenge Dubai and Turkey? You know, we spent a lot of time in the report and today talking about those two countries, but there will certainly be others. So what is your prediction on who will be next?
I think the one that would like to be it next, I don't think they can succeed right now, is Saudi Arabia. A couple other potentials out there. It's not a banking center, but certainly having that strategic interest and as a NATO member, there's a couple that could line up well. Unfortunately, one is potentially Malta, which has had a long, it is generally considered the most corrupt country in Central and Eastern Europe. Hungary, of course, with its continuing slide into greater and greater authoritarianism. Excuse me. And in the Middle East, unfortunately, with the slide to autocracy, I think we are going to have to look at Israel as well, as the rule of law breaks down, as checks and balances. If the Supreme Court evisceration really does occur, because we have a series of individuals already busted for tax evasion, trying to keep immunity for their prior corrupt acts and not going to jail for it. I think we're going to have to look hard at that.
Presentations during the time of COVID means there's a lot of coughing. Larry, what's your prediction?
I don't have one, but I just want to add one twist to what Jodi has said. The European Union has got to crack down on Malta, particularly with respect to these golden visas, which has been a way that a lot of Russian kleptocrats have essentially purchased EU citizenship and a lot of the privileges and legal abilities to move money around more easily that come with it. Malta is really the soft, has been a soft underbelly of vulnerability legally for the European Union, and they've got to get more serious about closing that off.
Matthew?
So I just like to flag an issue that I actually talk about in my forthcoming book, which is the prospect of subnational kleptocracy. So basically, and I think you can apply the same to sort of subnational bridging jurisdictions. We've kind of alluded to this when talking about the role of Delaware and Wyoming and Nevada, and I would put New Hampshire in there, right? And they're mooting this law to make charitable foundations sort of exist in perpetuity and be highly secretive. But of course, there are a lot of other countries where the rule of law and democratic values are sort of really uneven and implemented differently. These could be countries that are federations or that have autonomous units within them. A good example, right, is of course the Isle of Man in the UK. So I think we need to focus more on the subnational variations within countries that are maybe corruption prone, but are not yet kleptocratic. And the same could be said about bridging jurisdictions.
Great. Okay, last one, and I will start with Larry because I know he has to run. China sort of came up briefly in this conversation, but it deserves a lot more time. So in 30 seconds or less, which is probably the meanest thing I will ever do to you, tell me if China is a kleptocracy, yes or no, why or why not?
I don't think it's the best lens to think about it. I think it is a corrupt and neo-totalitarian regime that has certain kleptocratic properties. But the reason why I wouldn't put it that way is because it's not very easy for people to get their money out of China now. And the regime has actually made it very difficult for large-scale business people to get their money out because they would face massive capital outflows if they liberalized. So it's in a rather distinct category. I do apologize that I need to go, but I actually have to teach a class right now on Zoom. So I'm going to leave, but thank you all. And just one final word of immense praise and admiration for this report and the work of its two authors.
Great. Thank you, Larry. Matthew and Jodi, do you want to take your 30 seconds to argue whether or not China Is a kleptocracy, even if Larry doesn't like the question?
You first or me?
You go for it.
Okay, we disagree on this one. I wouldn't say it is. I think it was a decentralized kleptocracy, but it is centralizing. I think it'll be interesting to see what Xi Jinping does if he deliberately takes Putin's model and tries to centralize the kleptocracy in the way that Putin has or not. But certainly there's enough evidence of the billions of dollars that senior Chinese leadership has taken. The corruption, which has been traditionally very decentralized there, but massive, is a feature of the system. It's not a bug. It's extremely predatory on a huge percentage of its population. So about 400 million of the population actually lives on less than $2,000 a year, despite the fact that Xi Jinping says there's no poverty. $2,000 a year is poverty, especially in Chinese cost of living. So you've got a very, very predatory regime that sucks wealth out of its particularly rural population at a subsistence level, robs from the poor to give to the rich, and the rich being the red aristocracy. And we don't actually know how much is overseas, but with the shadow banking system, we're finding evidence that there's a lot more Chinese money overseas. I do think it's probably consolidated more, that only Xi's favorites are able to move those billions of dollars, not as much of everybody that used to. So I would agree with Larry on that the structure of that and how you get the money out and who can has changed.
All right, I already know Matthew's answer, but I will let him answer for himself. Matthew?
Thanks. That's because you and Jodi have read the first draft chapter of my book, first chapter. So I'm going to play the contrarian point of view and just say, no, China doesn't meet what I consider to be sort of the defining characteristics of kleptocracy. Of a kleptocracy. I was also really convinced when I read the excellent book China's Gilded Age by Yuan Ang, who's a professor at Michigan. And she, of course, for those of you on the call are familiar, has a really interesting sort of unbundled framework for understanding corruption in states. And she makes the case that the primary mode of corruption predominant in China is access money. And this is a type of corruption that's very prevalent in the United States, the United Kingdom, several other non-kleptocracies. And so, in other words, there are a lot of kleptocrats in China. There are a lot of kleptocratic behaviors. There's a lot of corruption. But is it a kleptocracy? I would say no. But in my book, I talk about borderline kleptocracies because kleptocracy isn't sort of a black and white thing, right? There's a spectrum or a motion towards kleptocracy where the judgment call is hard to make. And I think the points that Jodi made and that Larry made show that this is an issue where there's significant evidence on both sides, and one which doesn't alter the facts, right? Which is that China is the world's, mega economy, and it's got huge corruption problems, and those are intertwined with its political environment. So I took a minute, but I needed to flesh that out and have doubled the rebuttal time.
You just lost your house. I think John would like to say some concluding remarks. I just want to thank you again for the great report and for today's discussion. John?
Thank you. Let me just add my appreciation. What a great discussion. How interesting, provocative. I'd even say spicy. It was really great to have you guys really tackle this from so many perspectives, ending as well with the Summit for Democracy, with this question of China. Actually sort of brings me to conclude by just pointing out and really appreciating the really important ways that you two in this paper, but also Melissa in her work here at the International Forum for Democratic Studies, have sought to really redefine how we understand the nature of these global challenges to democracy. These are challenges that must be seen in a transnational perspective, because this is the modern nature of which this happens. And many of what might have been possible to deal with 5, 10, 15 years ago in a sort of traditional manner, I think everything we've seen and heard in this conversation shows these challenges are continuing to change, to develop and emerge, and we need to be thinking how to do so. And among the key pieces that I draw from this are the recognition that this requires, more than just people inside their own countries. They're outmatched in many ways by the work we're looking at here. And the efforts and the work that you guys do in your paper, talking about the role of civil society and a networked approach to these solutions, really echoes some of the really important takeaways that I think I have from this conversation and from much of the work here. So let me thank you again for joining us. Let me thank Larry Diamond for joining us. And let me thank my colleague, Melissa Ayton, for her terrific work in bringing this paper, really from developing the idea, bringing it to fruition, and working closely with Jodi and Matthew, who've just been excellent partners to work with us. For those of you watching, stay tuned. This is one of much work that we've done on this area. Please do check out our website, ned.org, where you can find more work there, including most recently a podcast with the Angolan journalist Rafael Marques on the challenges of where kleptocracy has gone there after the authoritarian leader Dos Santos stepped down. Really, really interesting stuff. Look forward to having all of you who are following engage with us. Share the paper, take a look at its really good work, and thank you all. Look forward to continuing the conversation.